these are the rock stars of workforce housing.
So we're going to talk about what you see behind you, who we are, how our program works, some of the lessons we've learned, and a little bit about where we're going forward. So we'll dive into all these different topics.
So we are, in 1982, an intergovernmental agreement was established between the City of Aspen, Pickens County, and they created the Aspen-Pickens County Housing Authority. We had very forward-thinking Board of County Commissioners and City Council that started seeing that these homes that housed so many employees were being torn down, that they might have housed 10, 15 people, and they were being torn down into one single-family free market home. So they started seeing that way back when, and they created our program and undertook starting to put deed restrictions on properties out there and providing affordable housing. We do have right now a housing board. It's an 8-member housing board. 5 people vote. We have 2 city council people that sit on it, 2 Board of County Commissioners, and 4 community members. But the voting is each group has an alternate that sits on that in case somebody is not there. We were created as a multi-jurisdictional housing authority so that we do have the right to incur debt, borrow money, secure mortgages, and also go through condemnation processes if need be. We can also obtain grants as well.
So over half of the Pickens County workforce commutes from outside of Pickens County, which is something that I think makes us unique and why we very much try to build affordable housing in Pickens County to make sure that we are ensuring a strong and robust community.
There are basically 5 basic job sectors within Pickens County. We are definitely a resort community. The 5 job sectors are accommodation and food service, arts, entertainment and recreation, local government, real estate, and then the retail trade as well. There's a total estimated jobs of around 21,000. With an average income of around $73,000, a little over $73,000. And this slide can tell you a little bit more about low-wage jobs, mid-wage jobs, and high-wage jobs as well.
As you can see, the median sales price right now for a single-family home in Aspen is $7.9 million. Obviously, the majority of workers cannot afford that. I don't think anyone does, and certainly after COVID, we are seeing an influx of folks that aren't local wage earners. And so we are constantly trying to fight this.
And it is actually valley-wide as well. When the program first started, we saw it as an entrance into possibly a free market a long time ago, where somebody could start in a small, maybe rental place, they get into maybe owning a one-bedroom, and then eventually maybe getting into a two-bedroom, and then buying something down valley, which we count down valley as anything that's Basalt, Glenwood Springs, Carbondale, Elgibel. Now it's really almost impossible to buy anything up and down the valley for anybody who's just a part of our workforce. When I first started in 1992, we used to have planning as part of our staff as well. That's no longer part of it. The city and the county, if there's any employee housing that's built by a government entity, it is the city or the county. Housing Authority just maintains the program. When I first started, I think we had like 7 or 8 people. We have 16 people right now. And we do have a property side as well. We manage about 300 units that the city of Aspen owns. And we have 2 property managers, and we have our maintenance personnel as well that maintain these units. And then we also have a sales manager, because all deed restricted properties, the majority have to be sold through the Housing Authority. We have a compliance officer who oversees compliance. We have a housing policy analyst now that's going to help us with new policy changes that we want to see come forward. And we also now have an IT person, which is helping with our software system, which is our management system is called HomeTrek, and it works through sales.
So I'm gonna look just so that I can talk you through this. So here's an example for a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house. So if 2 people earn $45,000, the home price might be $77,000, or the rent would be $885. So we really try to tailor our home prices and our rental rates to match those AMI categories that we're going to talk a little bit about how our program's set up. But we tailor those units to a certain income group.
And part of the reason they can do this is because 95% of their program is locally funded. So they can subsidize to the level needed to meet people at their actual needs. And it's I haven't seen any other program that does it to the level that Aspen does, other than military housing.
So there are basic 4 ways that units are acquired. The city and the county act as developers. In our land use codes, both in the city and the county, there's employee mitigation requirements. Depending on what you build, you have to mitigate for a certain amount of employees. We do have a priority process on that we prefer on-site or off-site. There is number 2, and then there's actually a fee in lieu that can be charged as well, which is our very last resort, because it's not high enough for anybody to actually create a unit for that mitigation requirement. There are private developers who also will build employee housing. We have a program called the Affordable Housing Credit Program. So if somebody builds a 100% affordable housing project, they can earn credits from that they can sell to people who need to mitigate for housing down the line. And so we get the 100% affordable housing project done prior to the need, because it has to be those things, the housing actually has to be done first for them to get the credit. And then there are some employers out there that will purchase a property, and then they will put a deed restriction on the property so that they can use it for their employees. And then now is my understanding, they can also utilize that credit program as well. So they can get a specific credit and then sell it to a developer who needs that to mitigate for housing. So it's the city of APSHA itself does not develop any housing, but these entities do for us.
So the basic requirements of our program, there's 3 that are written into our deed restrictions, which one is you have to work 1,500 hours a year within Pitkin County. You have to live in your unit 9 months a year, and you can't own other property in what we call the ownership exclusion zone, which is roughly a 2-hour drive around our area. You are allowed to own property outside of that, but not within our ownership exclusion zone.
Bethany, do you want to talk about for retirees?
Sure. So we do allow retirees to stay in our rental and ownership housing. In order to do that, you have to work 10 years prior to retirement age as defined by the IRS. So right now that's 67. You obviously can work later than that and longer, but you have to work those 10 years leading up to retirement. So this prohibits folks trying to move into Aspen and retire in our housing, which we do get phone calls often about, and it ensures that we're providing housing for the community. We also allow someone that has become disabled to maintain their housing unit as long as they've worked at least 4 years prior to that point of disability. So while we are workforce housing, we also try to ensure our community is staying strong and vibrant. Portfolio.
To compare this to Hawaii, 3,200 homes for a place with 7,000 full-time residents. Okay, that's like one permanently affordable home for every 2.5 people. When you crunch the numbers in Hawaii, it is one permanently affordable, price-restricted, not permanently affordable, sorry, one price-restricted home for every 90 residents, right? So it's just, they're in a whole different ballpark of really meeting the need.
And we also have a LIHTC program, a low-income housing tax credit program. What we have found out with our resort community is that we have a very hard time filling those LIHTC units, especially if they're 2 bedrooms, because we require minimum occupancy for these units. If it's a 2-bedroom, you either have to be a single parent or you have to be 2 working adults to live in that unit. And when you get 2 working adults in Pitkin County or in Aspen, they make too much. It's unfortunate because right now we probably have 4 or 5 units that have been sitting empty for over a year. And we have a wait list of people wanting to get into these units of over probably 50 to 100. But because they're LIHTC, you have to really be careful that you put the qualified person in those units, and we just can't find a household that meets that need. We do have a little over 3,200 units. They're about 1,800 ownership and 1,300 rentals. The community thought that it was a good idea to be able to have ownership type units in our inventory and not just rentals. One of the properties the first property that was an ownership unit probably, I believe, was in around the 1980s. And so again, we had very forward-thinking elected officials that brought this massive program forward to the community.
And could you speak a little bit about the price restrictions on your ownership units?
Yes, we have maximum household, we have maximum sales prices depending on the category. We have 5 different categories with what we call a resident occupied. The categories 1 through 5, there's a maximum household income and maximum net assets for those units. And then the resident occupied designation You just have to be working full-time in Pickens County, and your net assets can't be over, it's a little over $2 million. And that might seem a lot to people, but in the area when you're still trying to house doctors and you're still trying to house lawyers, you need to have that great big huge discrepancy, or the how we have category 1 through RO, those income and asset limits.
And so I know earlier on the screen was AMI, area median income, and so our categories are set up to address 50% AMI all the way to 240% AMI. So we've really tried to target each of those groups that Cindy was just talking about, whether it is your doctor who can't afford the single-family home price, or it's your barista or your bank teller that needs a lower category unit. So we've set them up that way.
And then how much can the value of the property go up every year?
So our ownership units, the majority of our deed restrictions, so state that a property can appreciate at 3% or CPI, whichever is less, and that's simple, it's not compounded. And the reason behind that is that it maintains affordability over the tenure of that unit. A few of our properties appreciate slightly higher, but the majority of ours go at that 3% amount.
There are a lot of benefits for people to own. First of all, you have that security that you know what your amount of, not rent, but your mortgage is going to be on a monthly basis, so you can plan on that. There's that security of having a home and a roof over your head, and it's the asset growth as well. So you do, even though it's not a ton that you gain on your asset, you still do. So when you do finally go to sell it, you are still getting some money off of that when you sell it. The challenges are the lack of incentives that we have for general upkeep. And most people who are owners, they're going to take good care of their home. They're not going to care. Other people are going to look at it as, well, if I replace my hot water heater, am I going to be able to add that to my sales price? If I have to replace windows, am I going to be able to add that to my sales price? And that's one of the things that we do allow a certain amount of capital improvements to be added, but they do appreciate down over time. So if somebody has replaced their refrigerator, usually appliances have about a 15-year life. So if they buy a brand new refrigerator and they sell it in 5 years, then they've lost a third of the cost of that when we figure out what their maximum sales price is. Also, the cost of maintenance is going a lot higher and higher for all these HOAs that we have out there. We're seeing, because where we are, of course, we have forest around us. We're on forest land all around us. So the wildfire dangers are very high, and trying to find insurance at a reasonable rate has been very, very hard for a lot of our HOAs out there. A lot of people, when they're brand new owners, they don't know what an HOA is, or homeowners association, and they don't know how to run an HOA. So what we have started doing in new properties is that we require them to have a property manager that can show them the ropes for at least the first year. And then after that, if they want to self-manage, they can, but that way they can at least learn. We've also created where brand new projects, they have to have a capital reserve study done at the time the project is done, and then they have to have a capital reserve fund, and they have to start putting money into that capital reserve on a monthly basis. It's part of their HOA dues. It's some of these older HOAs, they've been really good at doing that, and some have not. We are going through a study right now of capital reserve studies for a lot of the properties who opted in. The Housing Authority is paying for it. So we can see how far behind or how well these HOAs are running. So that's working out right now. But those are the main challenges, is of really giving people incentives to maintain their property and to maintain their HOA.
Okay, so compliance and enforcement. So what we have learned, this is looking a little bit ahead of a lesson learned. In about 2018, we started a compliance program. What we realized is we needed a staff member to focus on compliance and making sure our units were being utilized in the way that the deed restriction and our regulations set forth. And what I mean by this is that people are still working in Pickens County. They're still living in their unit. They haven't bought other property in that ownership exclusion zone. So we have one dedicated staff member and outside counsel who assists us. We have 3 types of actions. So we're a complaint-driven system. Folks can submit anonymous complaints through our website. They can call us, they can write us letters, and let us know if someone in the community is no longer working or no longer living in the unit. And then we will do a full investigation through procedures that are set forth in our rules. We do notice of investigations and notice of violation letters. We have a hearing officer structure, so we have an additional individual who will hear basically a homeowner and APSHA issue, and the hearing officer will decide these cases. And we've also put into place a fine structure, which has helped us. We put that into place in 2020, and it basically says if you're violating a certain provision of the regulations or your deed restriction, you owe APSHA money. These are tools that we hope help people comply better with those regulations, but we have discovered that there is a sense of entitlement once you get into an ownership unit, that it's mine and I deserve it, and so I don't necessarily need to follow the rules anymore. And so we have taken great steps to combat that. But what we've also found through our auditing process is that most of our homeowners, I think we're running at 95% are in full compliance. And so we've been sending out almost 30 audits a month on our ownership units. So it's a good chunk right now, and they are working in Pickens County. They are living in their units, and they're following the rules to a T. So while there might be some sense of entitlement and some sense of folks not following the rules, what we're actually finding is that they are, which is great. The other tool that we use is a biennial affidavit. And so every 2 years we send out to all of our homeowners an affidavit that they have to attest to the fact that they're still living in the unit, they're still working in Pickens County, and they don't own other property. So that handles our ownership side, and then from our rental side, all of our renters have to requalify every 2 years. So they have to submit a brand new application to us every 2 years documenting their employment.
But there is a program complexity that we have. The deed restrictions have changed over time. We've learned different things almost on a yearly basis. We readdress our deed restriction every single year. So if we think that we're missing something, or if all of a sudden when we've found that somebody is missing the boat or they've interpreted something different, we will change our regulations and then we will modify the deed restriction. The deed restriction is something that when any new project is sold, we have the right of first refusal, so it goes through the housing authority, and then we put an updated deed restriction on it. So that's how we update a lot of these deed restrictions. Again, we're working the capital reserve funds for HOAs. We're working with all of our HOAs now to try to figure out how we can help them with this. Another lessons learned is the affordability and the aging of our inventory. We have some units out there that are under old deed restrictions that they don't get credit for capital reserves or capital improvements, so they can go under a new deed restriction if they want to. Some of our projects were built in like the late 1970s, early 1980s, and we're seeing that it does need a lot of work, is what we're seeing. We, again, on our outdated or ineffective regulations, with some of the information that we gather when we do audits, we find that we have to tweak our regulations and our policies, and we do that as much as we possibly can with our board. Our board is policy. They approve policy, and we take that to our housing board. And then compliance is necessary. You have to have some type of compliance in this. And we beefed up our compliance with adding a person who that's what she is dedicated to do, is to make sure that people are in compliance.
So the realities, we have limited land. Mm-hmm. We are surrounded by national forest, or it's been built up.
Yeah.
We have nowhere left to build. You take it.
High construction costs. What we're finding now is that the city is doing a brand new project called the Lumber Yard within the next few years, and we're finding that it's going to cost over $1 million per unit to build that project of almost 300 units. Limited contractors. If you can even find somebody to come and replace your roof, we had to, where I live in employee housing, and we had to replace our roof last year, and we had to go outside the valley to find anybody who was even interested in touching it. Because construction of the huge free market and these huge homes takes all these people, we have very few contractors that will work on a smaller project or where somebody in an HOA of a deed restricted project can even afford it. And again, the aging infrastructure of our units and retirees. We do get asked a lot as to why are we allowing retirees to stay in their unit, and that was always something that the elected officials believed in, is that you need the retirees to be a community. We are a community. You need them to, because a lot of retirees will volunteer, they still are part of a community. And a lot of people who are of retirement age are continuing to work full-time or at least part-time. So it's always been very important to be able to sustain the retiree people in our market.
So this is a little bit about what Cindy just mentioned, the lumber yard. So this is coming up. This is our next big project that the city of Aspen is building. It's going to be 287 units with a price tag of about $400 million.
Is that low?
That's the low end.
That's probably going up as we speak.
Every day.
And so, even with this high cost, they bring down the price and sell it to their workforce for 80 grand if you're in the low end, or 200 grand, right? So it really does come down to subsidy.
There has to be a subsidy for it to work.
Good morning, everybody. Pete Strecker. So we'll just walk through a handful of slides, and I'm sure this will kick off a lot thereafter. I did want to start off with, kind of why do we do affordable housing? Obviously, you all have figured this out as well, but affordability is quite a challenge. This gives you an example for the city. I know Cindy had mentioned some of these other nearby communities that we might have some folks live in, from Basalt to Glenwood Springs for us. Those names mean nothing to you, but I put the kind of commute times, if you will, to get to Aspen from there. So 20 minutes up to an hour. We have people living well past that hour-long mark to almost 2 hours that are commuting into our valley. But this is what we consider kind of that spectrum of where a lot of our workforce comes from. And you can see in there the first column the average cost for a one-bedroom unit in those different communities. Obviously, Aspen being quite high at $4,800 just for a single-bedroom unit. And then what I've done there is taken the next column over and said, well, if you have to pay for that rent, what does that equal on an hourly basis if you're working at 2,000 hours a year, right, essentially? So you need about $27 an hour just to afford that one-bedroom unit in Aspen, versus in the Glenwood Springs an hour away, you need to basically make $9 an hour to be able to pay for your rent in a given month. So then if you say, well, affordability under kind of the national guidelines has always been 30% of your income goes towards your housing costs, you get the last column that really says, well, this is what those people need to make that unit kind of affordable. So pretty astronomical when you look at Aspen at $91 an hour to basically afford a one-bedroom unit. That does not include utilities, that does not include your HOA dues, that doesn't include those types of extra costs. So that's pretty substantial, and it's kind of why we're running these types of programs. Just so you know, the bottom chart is actually the City of Aspen employee base. Those are our filled employees. We have about 340-ish employees, and we broke them down by hourly rate, basically. And so in the City of Aspen, we have 6 people that could actually live in the City of Aspen affordably. If they
Six
did not-
people, you said?
6 people, 6 people. Affordably in a one-bedroom unit, if they did not have a subsidized housing, a free market unit. So it just kind of paints the picture, right? So obviously we need to pay for some of this stuff to make this a little bit more affordable. The first way Aspen has really done that has been taxes. And the city was really early in this process. We jumped into the game about 45 years ago and started creating tax sources for this program that Cindy and Bethany both communicated very well to you. The city has long had 2 separate taxes. One is a real estate transfer tax or a property conveyance tax. So anybody that buys a unit in the city of Aspen basically pays a 1% fee to acquire that home. It's a tax. That is something that has really served the city well. The state of Colorado no longer allows that type of taxation process. Starting in 1992, they passed a constitutional amendment to the state so that no other communities could do this. So there's about 10 communities, I believe all are actually mountain resort communities that actually still have one of these in place. So we hold on to this.
So you repeat,
Yeah.
I think you were saying now it's against the Constitution, so other places cannot do it?
That's correct. So in the state of Colorado, you cannot create a new real estate transfer tax. Those that already have it are grandfathered in as long as they stay in existence. So yeah, it's a big deal, and you'll see why in a moment. We also had a sales tax that was dedicated both towards affordable housing and childcare. So it was kind of a two-pronged approach for some really important community infrastructure needs in that kind of workforce space. And so those dollars go obviously to affordable housing development, but it actually goes to another program which subsidizes daycare within our community, which increases quality, reduces costs to the workforce and things like that. More recently, in 2023, we actually passed a new tax, a short-term rental tax. This was identified as a source to further our program. Basically, as Cindy mentioned, the cost of building, the cost of acquiring land has gone up so substantially that even with the resources we're already bringing in, we needed more. Basically because we are getting outpaced by the demand versus the supply that we can provide. So we started this new tax. We did probably 8 stakeholder meetings with the lodging community. I will tell you it was very rough with them. But when we went to the ballot, it had strong support and passed. So that just went in May of 2023. We're estimating that tax is actually split between affordable housing, infrastructure needs, and environmental impacts due to increased tourism essentially from that type of industry. 70% of the revenue goes to affordable housing. That was the absolute minimum that the council required and the voters adopted in the ballot. 70% of the tax revenue.
So 70% of the short-term rental revenue goes specifically to the housing program.
Yep.
Where does the other 30% go?
So the other 30% is split between the infrastructure support as well as the environmental initiatives. So just basically maintaining your roads, bridges, things of that nature that's getting wear and tear. Some of the utility infrastructure could possibly use it, although we haven't dedicated it that way. And then environmental initiatives, so anything for greening the environment because of all the extra tourism.
And to compare it to Hawaii, short-term rental taxes are different by county. So every county has different rates. and I think they go somewhere between about 5 to 8%. Does that sound right, Autumn? It's, okay, anyway, so we're a little bit lower than that, but yeah.
So just to give you a sense of what does the money look like when you have this real estate transfer tax that you cannot create any new ones of these in the state of Colorado, this gives you kind of the dollar value per year of what that's generating for us. For a 4 square mile town with 7,000 permanent residents. Last year it was 15 million. We got as high as into 20 million a year. Over the course of this period right here on the screen, that's $225 million. Pretty substantial. The drawback to this type of taxation is the volatility that you can see on the screen. We have big influxes coming in. It depends on cycles of the real estate market and when things close. We also have substantial single-family home closures that can really throw off any sort of projection. The highest single home price was $76.5 million, I think, 2 years ago. Yeah. So sometimes it's not about how much volume sells, but just what type of units selling. So there was that other slide on sales tax. That's okay. That sales tax is a little bit unique, like I said, that it goes both to affordable housing and it goes to childcare. The one real unique thing is the ballot left that split between those two purposes vague and actually let the council to decide that versus the voters. So sometimes it has been about a 50-50 split going to each types of those programs. More recently, the council actually adopted to really shift it more to the child care side because we're looking at trying to do some child care expansion because of limited availability for that type of program for the workforce again. So that is a kind of a nice thing if you're trying to go after a ballot question to your communities. You might build in some variability for the local governing board to kind of decide how to flex those kind of resources. This is that new short-term rental tax, and this is by month, not by year, because we've only had this since May of 2023. But I did touch on this, that it really is reflective of a tax. It's 10% on what we call second homeowner or investment type properties, so they get taxed a little bit higher. The other types of short-term rentals are owner occupied, so they'll rent out a room or their home for a period of time while they're not occupying it. Or what we have are something called condo hotels, basically. So they're individually owned units within a broader condominium complex. It's all managed like a hotel. It has its own website, marketing platform, property manager on site, those types of things. So it really is trying to act like a hotel, but it's actually individual ownership units. We tax those only at a 5% level instead of a 10% level. The reason for the difference in the tax rate was actually the aspect that the property tax in Colorado varies by whether you're residential or you're commercial. Commercial gets taxed closer to 29% on their property tax, and not tax, but assessed value is set by 29%. Residential's under 7%. So there was this big disparity, but yet they were both acting like lodging entities, and so we were trying to kind of equate those things a little bit more closely when we applied the tax. So in addition to taxation, we obviously have fees. This is not something that generates quite as much money, but it is a way to have a real direct correlation again to some of the workforce that's generated by continual growth and development. And so this is all run under our community development department, and it's based in the land use code. And it's basically set as you generate a portion of an FTE for every 1,000 square feet being developed. And the rates are slightly different whether you're commercial or just recently we added residential to this component as well. And so based on how much square footage you're adding, we do a multiplier for how many FTE that would need to generate in workforce need, and then basically compute the dollar value. And folks can either do one of two things. They can mitigate on site and they don't have to pay any of these fees, or they basically pay these fees into the city of Aspen, and the city of Aspen is what's taking those dollars in and banking those to then apply into future developments or acquisition needs.
So to summarize, if someone wants to build a new restaurant, then they have to calculate, well, how many employees will need housing that work in my restaurant, and then they got to pay for that.
Right. So their direct needs, so their true employees plus some residual, basically, because of you might need trash service then to come pick up the trash that's created by that building. So it's all kind of computed into the total FTE that's generated from those 1,000 square feet. Same thing's true when you do an addition on your home. There's somebody in the back. This slide? What was your question?
What does the AMP
Sorry.
stand for?
No, sorry, that's my bad use of an acronym. That's our asset management plan. So it's kind of a capital plan for the city. So due to governmental accounting, you have to have a capital plan, you have to have a debt service plan, you have to have, unless you're enterprise funds, then they're all inclusive in their funding. This is just a little bit of a nuance. But that is basically the fund that we drop some of the short-term rental money in to help with the infrastructure needs. So our buildings, our roads and bridges. General fund, correct. And that's where we run our environmental initiatives out of. You bet. Okay. So in terms of that fee structure, you can see that this again is really volatile. It depends on the pace of development, what's happening. So if we have a big hotel that comes in that was maybe existed prior to some of these land use codes, they basically had no credit on the books for what they may have already mitigated for. So if they did a scrape and replace, they would have to pay for the full development and the full FTE generated by that development. If you've already got a building in place and you already paid for that FTE generation in the past, and then you just basically come back, scrape, and build maybe only slightly bigger, you only have to pay the delta for that extra development. You don't repay for the entirety of the cost.
In your prior slide, you have different categories.
Yes.
Is that based on the number of employees or the revenue generated by those businesses? Hawaii has a lot of small businesses. So I'm just trying to understand how that's utilized and what you've seen the effect regarding businesses coming into Aspen.
Yes. So these categories actually directly reflect the APSHA categories for ownership or rental units and how we set the prices for those units. So based on the type of FTE that you need when you do a new development, so if you're doing a hotel, you need a lot of frontline staff, a lot of cleaning services, a lot of restaurant workers. Those are potentially lower on the pay scale. So they'll fall in the lower categories and what you would have to pay into if you don't mitigate on site. Like I said, some businesses, particularly larger ones, can do a lot more of their own mitigation. They do it on site, or they have another site within the urban growth boundary that they'll purchase and build for their own employees. So then they satisfy that requirement and they don't have to pay these fees. The smaller businesses are the ones that typically then wind up having to pay into these types of operations. But that's if you're building from scratch. If you're just coming in and renting an existing building, you're not paying this cost. It's the person that owns that building. So I think this was maybe 24 million over the last, 20 years, it looks like. So it's not small dollars, but it's not kind of dollars we were talking about in some of those taxation sources. So the average income for like a bus driver in Aspen is about $30 an hour. And in fact, they're in a process of potentially going on strike at the end of this year because they're asking for $40 an hour, plus a housing stipend. Cashiers in our community make $25 to $27 an Administrative assistants make a minimum of like 23 and up. So these types of wages basically start to quickly preclude some sort of LIHTC option when you have multiple individuals looking for a home at the same time. This is what Cindy was alluding to, that we have a number of 2-bedroom units that we can't fill, which is heartbreaking when you really think of the need that's out there. So for the city of Aspen specifically, we are starting to steer more and more away from looking at any sort of LIHTC option. Tax credit partners just don't work for us for that reason. It also becomes really challenging to afford the maintenance on the properties once they are built. We just redeveloped one of our tax credit properties with a new tax credit partner in 2016, 2017, and we actually just had to pump in some more money into that enterprise fund. Basically, it's run as an enterprise. We had to put money in from our own development fund to redo some of the parking lots and some other things that we had to engineer out when we did the redevelopment, just because we couldn't fund it at the time. And the property doesn't generate enough money on its own to actually do some of these really big maintenance projects. So we are trying to steer more and more away from LIHTC for those types of reasons. But partnerships can work. The city has been a developer, it's been a landowner, it's been an operator of employee housing units and affordable housing units. But we have found that public-private partnerships with different entities can take the place of one or all of those things with us if we partner with them on those projects. So you guys alluded to the aspect that the lumberyard is coming online. The low estimate is 400 million. The high estimate's closer to 700 or 800 million at this point. That is a big project for a 4 square mile community. But if we bring in other partners that can help operate this and create this, we're in a better place to do that. So right now the city has penciled in like, hey, well, we can probably pony up about $220 million to that project as it gets developed, if the partners can come with the rest. And what we would typically do is do some sort of a land lease option. So we would do, we did 3 of these actually back in 2020, yeah. So we did a couple of these, 3 of these recently, or the smaller ones. They were 25 units here, 10 units at another place, and I think 15 or so at a third place. And we partnered with a single developer. We provided the land with the 65-year lease on it. They came in and built. We provided construction financing, which got partially repaid, and then a little bit of permanent financing that's subordinate, and then they brought in the rest of the money, and then they operate the facilities for us. It's all rental, and it has a waterfall effect, essentially. So as money comes in, it has to go to the important needs first, and if there's any money left over at the end, it starts paying off subordinate debt back to the city and things of that nature. But the city was really in it for, A, getting the housing for the community, and B, knowing it was going to subsidize it. So it was never intended to really, immediately pay off the subordinate debt.
Did you have a question, Ryan?
While we're working on that, I do think you're right that as soon as you have some visible projects and tangible benefits to a program, obviously you have the ability to kind of carry that along a bit. You can certainly start a bit smaller on your programming and grow that over time. Obviously, we don't have 3,000 units in this program come day one, and we're continuing to build new units. I mean, we had a projection of another 2,000 units needed or something of that nature. So if you go by that standard, we have a long ways to go, quite honestly.
Land banking is kind of important as well to start, because the longer you wait, obviously land keeps going up and up and up. And what's hard for us now is that we are surrounded by Forest Service land. So we really now have to look more down valley. We have going out of town one way. We're now we're a cul-de-sac. We have one way in Aspen and one way out. Our second way out, Independence Pass, closes every November, and it doesn't open up until Labor Day, or not Labor Day, Memorial Day. Memorial Day. So we're also a cul-de-sac area where there's one way in and one way out. So again, limited land, we just don't have that anymore.
And actually, I'd like to reinforce that. So the lumberyard project that we're doing now, we owned a 3-acre vacant lot across from our airport where this site is ultimately going to be. In 2007, we acquired 4.5 acres right next door to it. It's called the lumberyard because it was actually an operating construction supply company, right? And so we purchased that in 2007 for $18 million. So that created a site then of 7.5 acres, and we were really excited about that. In 2018, somebody came to the city and said, I own the mini storage next door to the lumberyard, and they offered to sell it to us. We bought that for $10 million. So we now have a roughly 10 to 11 acre site. We've put in a lot of money over time, but that was laying the groundwork for something that's going to happen 25 years later to 30 years later. So in some regards, I would really echo Cindy, and obviously you're living in a island community. There's only so much land as well. That is one of the biggest needs that you're going to have is land. Actually, one thing that's good about buying some of these things is if you can find good property that's suitable for this type of development, and you have certain businesses already on site. So in case the lumberyard as well as that mini storage, they were generating money for us while we didn't tear them down and kind of held this land. So it kind of started to pay some of it off. I think we made $7 million on the lumberyard over that 18 years we held it. The mini storage, surprisingly, is a very good business model, just in case you wanted to know. We were making $600,000 or $700,000 net on a handful of storage units up in Aspen. So it brought down the property value by $2.5–3 million over that short period of time.
Hi, everybody. My name is Autumn. I want to ask a bit of a different question. I get the mechanics of your guys' program, and it's amazing. And the numbers are really progressive, and meeting people where they're at is really progressive. I called Cindy 10 years ago from a council member's office asking about perpetual deed restrictions and, meeting people's where they're at really instead of relying on HUD numbers all the time. And still yet, 10 years later, we still have affordable homes that are government subsidized that are being sold for $650,000, $700,000. We still have 5, 8, and 10-year deed restrictions maximum. I look at your guys' numbers about what it costs to construct a unit. It's $1 million. That actually makes me really happy because if you guys can do it at those numbers, we should be able to do it, right? We have a larger population with more off-island owners. All the math in our case makes sense. We should be able to do this. The question I have for you guys is, 10 years into this conversation, we still have to go to meetings and listen to people say, cost of construction is too high, so we can't bring affordable housing costs down anymore. $600,000 home is the best we can do. We still have to listen to people say, you can't tax STRs because they're our economy, so don't touch it. We still listen to people say, perpetual deed restrictions are going to kill the middle class because that's the way we build wealth, even though that wealth building tool is not even accessible to our workforce because they can't get into a $1.4 million house to start with, right? So we're talking into this chamber. So my question for you is, you guys are 40 years into this? What happened? Was there a thing at the beginning of this that caused people in Aspen to wake up? What was the thing that made leadership in your community say, we have to do better? Was it a one thing? Was it a series? Can you guys call our policymakers and be like, you know, yeah.
I would say probably when the city council and the Board of County Commissioners started seeing a lot of these homes that were basically apartment complexes, suddenly that housed so many employees, suddenly being torn down. Sorry. Suddenly being torn down, and then people going in, I'm losing my housing. So the city was very proactive, and the county. The county started a lot of this before the city got into it, but they started seeing this and they started reacting where they needed to do something. And at the very, very beginning, our deed restrictions were not in perpetuity. We had one attorney, a city attorney, who didn't think that that could happen. And so we are still dealing with some units out there that it's really weird because some of them they're 25 years after the death of the last Board of County Commissioner who approved the project. So we have one county commissioner that is still alive, and so the 25-year mark hasn't quite hit yet. So what we
And he's
do,
on life support, right?
yeah, we'll keep it as much as we can. So we actually, when we do run into those, we do change the deed restrictions on them into perpetuity. What has also happened is that when people come forward to do a project, in order to do a huge project, they have to make some concessions on that because they're asking for the additional approval to do more than what they really are allowed to do. So in order to do that, that developer has to give concessions. So that developer understands, we're okay if you do this, but you have to provide this amount of affordable housing with this deed restriction on it in perpetuity. If you don't want to do that, that's fine, but then you're going to have to build a lot smaller project. So they've had that understanding through our land use code. And our land use code used to go through a growth management scoring system, which they do not anymore. But that was always important for the city and the county as well, so that they could kind of slow down such big, huge projects. One of the things when we were talking about we can't get construction workers, if the city put a moratorium on building for 2 years or 3 years, maybe we could get those free market people that have constructors that can't do that working on ours. But anytime we try to put a moratorium through, we get a lot of pushback. And a lot of it comes from the real estate market, the realtors, because they want bigger and better, so their commissions are bigger and better. And Aspen is one town where we actually have more real estate brokers than we do lawyers. And that's pretty unusual. So, but it really was that Board of County Commissioners and that City Council who really saw that. And when the city saw that we needed an additional tax, and they passed that real estate tax before, and the bill, I believe, is the Tabor Act in Colorado. And that was one of the best things that the city ever did, was to pass that. My understanding is that the legislature, I thought at one point in time, was trying to work on easing that up for resort communities. They have not done that yet, but they were thinking of possibly allowing people to do some type of real estate transfer tax in these resort communities, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, actually, the state is looking at, well, I don't say the state, some lobbyists are looking at trying to implement a real estate transfer fee instead of a tax.
I see.
Which sounds very similar. It's still levied the same way. The stipulation would be that it has to be for affordable housing because there has to be that very strong nexus between the fee and the use of the fee. So it is something that's been gone through the legislature. I think it'll come up actually again this new session that's starting. It went through last year and didn't make it. So we'll see if it pushes forward.
Yeah, so we do want to give some time for a break and make sure we can also listen to our Bay Area folks that are here to talk about acquisition rehab. I think some of the reason Aspen was able to do it more quickly is because it is a smaller place, so you see the impact. It's in your face more, right? I think, when you start to lose, whenever that was in the 70s, 80s, when you're losing that housing and you're a small town, I think you feel it more. But I think we're getting to that point here in Hawaii. So, yeah, we've been past that point. I know, we've been past that point. But, so I just want to really, really thank all of you guys for being here and making this a very robust and informative discussion.